Welcome to Lead Today with me, Kalina. Let's talk leadership. Hi, welcome back. We are continuing along with The Undiscovered Self, The Dilemma of the Individual in Modern Society by Carl Jung. We're in chapter 2, Religion as the Counterbalance to Mass-Mindedness. I'm going to try and go through really with themes so that if you want to read the book, you can, and for time. I've also tried to record this episode twice already, and so I'm finding that the information in my mind is very simple, but when I go to explain it, it isn't. And my whole aim with these chapters is to be relatively understandable. And this chapter is pretty short, so you would think that I could summarize it quickly or succinctly, but we're talking about sort of big ideas here. I want to first define religion the way that Jung is defining it so that we're all on the same page, and make the distinction between religion and what he defines as a creed, which is really, I think, when we bring in the social component. So a creed is more what a church practices or a religious institution, because again, we're focused on the individual in this series, right? And the idea is the moment you take an individual and you make any kind of institution out of a group of individuals under the guise of quote unquote community. Last time we talked about the state, right? Anytime we do that, his thoughts are, well, we're getting further away from, let's say, what was intended, because the level of analysis is at the level of the individual. So religion, by Jung's definition, means the dependence on and submission to the irrational facts of experience. So what does that mean? Well, these do not refer directly to social and physical conditions. They concern far more the individual's psychic attitude. Another one where it's like, okay, what's psychic attitude? Well, first, let's just say dependence on and submission to the irrational facts of the experience. So it's the opposite of reason. So worldly, and then, or reasonable, reason, rational. And then there's this beyond physical world. He calls it repeatedly extra mundane, which means beyond the physical world. Supernatural is another word that's used, irrational. And his whole idea is that religion is your relationship to that force, that part of the experience, which is irrational. It's your submission to, but dependence on, and relationship. And so we call that word often God, as that force larger than ourselves, right? Or outside of this world. And he mentions God many times. And I think what God is meant to be is, well, religion is you in direct relationship to this irrational part of the human experience, which is sort of interesting, right? Because he says that without that, we really don't have any need for decision-making whatsoever. And let's go down the steps, because I wrote notes. This was kind of step by step, made sense to me while reading it, but then again, saying it out loud, I feel like it can get muddied. So, okay, religion versus creed. Religion is your direct relationship to God, which is the irrational parts of the experience. It is outside of the physical world, beyond the physical world. It's your relationship to that. Your relationship with God is religion. Okay, so submitting to and being in reverence of and or depending on this irrational part of the experience. Okay, so it's not a church. A church, he defines, or anywhere we've got individuals in a group trying to bring ourselves to that divine, right, or to that irrational part of the experience, he defines as a creed. So right off the bat, I just want to kind of go and split those two things based off of his definition. Creed is a church. You have something he calls mass believers, which can get into the same idea as mass man. And the idea of mass-mindedness is what we talked a little bit about last time. So you get a bunch of individuals, they form an institution. The institution in and of itself is ambiguous because we have to be analyzing at the level of the individual. Why? Because we are not an average. And so if you take 30 people and get the average of that, right, of that collective, the problem with that is that there's so many individual nuances within the people that are in that group. And so he says, okay, you can have groups, right? But operating under the guise of state or church or community is problematic when you're making decisions at the level of state or church or community, because you have to factor in tolerances and leeway for the individual, because no one person encompasses the whole community in the sense that no one is average. So one person is part of the whole, but if you try to account for the whole of a community, you're going to run into trouble. Okay, so here's another sort of interesting statement. Just as man as a social being cannot in the long run exist without a tie to the community, so the individual will never find the real justification for his existence and his own spiritual and moral autonomy anywhere except in the extra-mundane principle capable of relativizing the overpowering influence of external factors. So what are we saying? Well, first of all, anywhere except in the beyond this world principle capable of relativizing, relativizing the overpowering influence of external factors. So external factors are things outside yourself, right? And so if you only have you and things outside yourself, the argument is, well, how can you have a focal point outside of things outside of yourself, the external factors, if you're just looking at you and external factors? It's hard to put yourself outside of that situation. And God, if you think of it as like you in the middle, external factors, and another circle outside of that, God or the irrational, it gives you a point of reference or perspective outside of the external conditions of life. And that's really, really fundamental to his whole argument here, in the idea that when we have, let's say, a dictatorship, a state that is trying to get rid of religion, they're doing that because they want to be that one source of truth. If there's only one condition, we don't need judgment because there's only one rational answer. And so he's warning against this. He's saying that's problematic if we just have things of this world, right? Whether that be the church or the state, that's a problem. The real thing that is the counterbalance to mass-mindedness is not the church. It is that connection that you have to God as the point of reference outside of the external conditions of life, because so much in life is irrational, and your individual fate, so much of it is outside of things that can be intellectualized or rationalized. And if we try to remove the irrational and just focus on the rational, I mean, you can think of it as trying to get rid of one side of the coin, right? You almost need both. You need the rational, the physical, the things that you can hear, see, smell, taste, touch, the senses, but you need the things that are also beyond the physical. We need that. Just as we need kind of black and white or up and down. I mean, it's sort of like you need a point of reference that's the opposite to what it is that you see in order to be able to see the things around you clearly, if that makes sense, right? And then he says that also you can't intellectualize this relationship really, because humans need evidence of transcendent experience in order to have spiritual and moral autonomy, which is the justification for existence, which is found in beyond the physical world. And that can't be intellectualized because the driving force of religion is irrational. Of course it's irrational. There's no, how can it be reasonable, right? If you try to approach something that's irrational with a rationale, with reason, of course you're going to come up and say it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist because I can't see it. But the thing is, how many things exist without seeing them? You know, love exists, but you don't see it. You might see how love comes into the physical world, right? Like if you buy somebody a gift or you give them a hug, that you're seeing the extra mundane, the beyond physical world love come into the physical world, right? But you can't see love as an entity, as an idea. And I think people, when we talk about transcendence experience, that's what's drawing so many people today to psychedelics or any kind of mind-altering substance, where they're trying to transcend the physical world in order to get closer to that connection with the irrational, with the supernatural, with the beyond physical world. And so we see this today, right, with people moving away from the church, saying, okay, the church isn't doing for me what I thought it would, or people have critiques of the church. And that's why I wanted to kind of start this whole discussion with the distinction of religion and creed, because we're not talking about church. We're talking about your own personal relationship, however it is that you cultivate that, with beyond the physical world, the elements that are outside of the external conditions of life. And that is, by Jung's definition, the foundation for freedom and autonomy is the awareness of the existence of that personal and reciprocal relationship between man and the authority that is beyond the physical world, which we call God, right? But that's the counterbalance to the world and reason. So again, if we look at it as two sides, we have worldly things, reason. The state appeals to that with, and so does the church, right? And he comes up with this, which is sort of also interesting over here, where he talks about how essentially you could have problems if you are mass-minded with the state, but also if you're a believer from the creed perspective, because while admitting that the state has a moral and factual claim, confesses to the belief that not only man, but the state that rules him is subject to the overlordship of God, and that in case of doubt, the supreme decision will be made by God and not by the state. Okay, but that's an issue because the idea is, again, the state, from my understanding, is not really an entity. And so you're still kind of, creeds are still captured or play with the state. The church plays with the state. And so it's really two institutions. And again, the idea is when things get institutionalized, that's when we can run into these potential problems, because we're dealing with the mass and not necessarily the individual level of analysis. And so insofar as churches or religions, the traditional, let's say, creeds, what he defines as creeds, insofar as they can remain focused on the level of the individual relationship with forces beyond the physical world, the authority that's beyond the physical world, insofar as a religion can connect the individual with that relationship, that's where he'll say, yeah, okay, there's merit in this. But when it goes into the social component, people just going to church because they should, or out of habit, or because it makes them look good from a moral perspective to others, right? All of those things are not really grounded in the basis of your relationship with the divine. And well, then you're going against the point. And the point of religion, again, let's get really clear, is your relationship, that reciprocal relationship, the awareness of that relationship between you and something beyond the physical world, because you have that. And Jung often talks about the soul. Maybe for another episode, we don't really get into that too much here. But the idea is you have this soul that transcends even your body, right? Which is worldly. And so rather than the church promising you something and you having to sort of, I guess, behave accordingly, the doctrine of the individual is dependent on God makes just as high a claim upon him as the world does. So the religions teach another authority opposed to that of the world. And he actually comes up with a few examples, which I'd like to kind of just quickly give you, which, okay, the meaning of purpose and religion lie in the relationship of the individual to God. So that's Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, or to the path of salvation and liberation, which is Buddhism. So both, right, are saying that without the individual's responsibility before God can be called nothing more than conventional morality. Because from that basis, all ethics are derived, essentially, right? When we think of where do we get our ethics in society, it's from that basis of we report not just to the authority of this world, the things of this world, but that really there's an authority opposed to that outside of the world. And that our dependence on that force is just as important as what it is of this world. Those are, again, we try to hold in the balance those two. And so when one of them, worldly objects, worldly figures, the state, the church, anything worldly, tries to stamp out the things out of this world, the beyond this world, that's when we're seeing, okay, we're in for some trouble, essentially. So, well, okay, what is a transcendent experience? How do we get closer to the divine? Like, what does that even mean? And I think you probably have experienced this in one way or another. And it's really, I think back in the back in the day. Ancestrally, there were shamans, and again, there were substances that were trying to get humans closer to that outside, beyond the world experience. But that there are things like ritualistic prayer, song, and dance, and that's where churches come into play, or religious institutions come into play, because they, again, the aim should be that they're aiming for individuals to come into relationship with God, and everything outside of that is sort of clutter from his estimation. And okay, why would we want this? Why would we care? Why do we care if, you know, if we're in this world and we're already having a tough enough time kind of dealing with the things of this world? Why would we possibly want to have a transcendent experience and go into something bigger than us? Why? And the answer that he proposes is, well, in having that beautiful relationship between things seen and unseen, right, or the world and the beyond this world, God and that notion gives us the ability to overcome worldly factors, desires, wishes, let's say some of them that could be problematic, like greed or the different sins that are encapsulated in religion. If we have that deep and personal reciprocal relationship with the authority beyond the physical world, then we have the ability to overcome worldly factors. And we need a goal beyond this world, which is what this religious function provides. The conscious regard for irrational factors of the psyche and individual fate. So some people, oh, I don't believe in fate. Okay, but you have this story that's going to play itself out, and you get to impact it insofar as what you choose to do and maybe how you guide your thoughts. You have this individual fate that's going to come of you, that you, and if it's predetermined or not is not really relevant for the purposes of our discussion right now. So you have this fate, right, that's going to happen one way or the other. And the idea is that you have a conscious regard for the irrational factors of both the psyche and this fate that's coming upon you. And, well, why do we care about that? Because I think you can't have only one. It just, even as we have the left and right side of the brain, you're leaving part of the equation out if you only look at things that are seen because they're rational, because they can be proven, because they're statistically significant, or because then if that's the fact, that's where we get into the trouble of, this is what the science says and it's a fact, right? Or this is what the state dictates, it's a fact. And he really warns against, you know, dictatorships, because the mass man in the state really gets into the problem of, there is no irrational, it's only rationally what it is that you're being told, or what it is that the one source of truth is. And if it's the state is the one source of truth, or the church is the one source of truth, you're really in for trouble, because there isn't just one source of truth for anything ever, and things are constantly changing, and there's so much that we don't know. Okay, and I mean, the more and more I read books like this, I just realize there's so much I don't know. And in this chapter, really, I think the point we're getting at is, look, there are things that are seen and unseen in this world, the unseen that are beyond this world. We're calling that religion, as the relationship between us and this awareness that there's something beyond this world. And that's really what we're getting at. That's like, if I was to just in one sentence, it's like, listen, you need a goal beyond this world that you're operating in, and this fate that's kind of coming to you and that you're creating for yourself. And you need something beyond it so that you can overcome worldly desires and things that can tempt you. And so you need something bigger than yourself, bigger than this world. You need something beyond this world to get away from your sense of self and get away from, well, the boundaries of our physical existence. And again, I think that's where people get drawn into psilocybin or different substances, because they think that's the portal to this bigger thing. But we've seen it not just in the past few years. I think there's a resurgence, and it's very outside of any kind of shamanism. Some rituals, ayahuasca, right, still have kind of that ritualistic, but some people are just microdosing and taking it from like this is what I do day to day to stimulate creativity. But the mysticism of consciousness and these transcendent states is just something that, I mean, humans have this innate curiosity about. And I really think that the main thing that we need to remember about this is that mind-altering substances might be one way, but we really know that it's not the only way. And that's where you have people that pray or meditate or have different rituals, chanting. I think that that's meant to, and the silence of that, which is the tuning out of the external physical world into yourself in order to commune with that higher, and we say higher power, right? And it's not higher, but it's outside of the physical world. And so again, all these words were religion and consciousness and beyond the physical world, extra mundane, irrational, right? It's kind of like we have all these words to describe what I think is forces unseen. And so if we just want to even simplify again and just say, okay, there are things that we see in the physical world, and that is worldly. And then we have things unseen that is out of this world, that is irrational. Then we can kind of reckon with, okay, well, it does make sense, even logically, which we're not supposed to necessarily come from this, from a logical perspective, but it makes sense that if you have things that are rational, you have to have the counterbalance. And that's why I think this chapter is called The Counterbalance to Mass-Mindedness. Mass-mindedness comes from a focus solely on the physical world and on these institutional structures that are created. And the structure's tendency to say, well, we are the one source of truth, and we'll tell you how to live, and we'll tell you what's right, and we'll tell you what's wrong, and we'll make the ethical decisions for you because we know best. And you're going to be a part of this community. But what happens is then we get into the place of, you're just a number within the community, and this average, you get built into this average, and community leads to, or can lead to, communism. And then that is pushed so hard as, do this for the community, that we breed a sense of mistrust, which we've seen in Eastern Europe and what's happened in socialist places as well, where, look, again, the value of a community, even if you think of, if you go to a cafe or a co-working place or your workplace, the value of the community of your workplace, it depends completely on the spiritual and moral values of the individuals composing it. So you have to have people with the individual of the same individual mind who will assert their claims within the community to make it better. You can't have the one source of truth and call it a community, and then people don't have any moral values of their own, because we're meant to kind of jostle against each other in order to come toward these different transcendent experiences, but also to come toward what it is that we're doing in the real world. Like, we're meant to kind of make each other jostle against each other and make each other better in the real world. And then also be in the awareness of the fact that there are things bigger than what it is that we have right now. And we see this also with people's fascination with aliens, I think, in some sense, because it is sort of out of this world. It's not the same though. But I think that's where we see people's interest in beyond Earth becomes at least beyond reason in some sense, because they feel like they're exploring other worlds, which they technically are other worlds. But I think that this is something else. This is what you get when you're in the silence, when you feel love or awe, when you are meditating or praying, when your sense of self is completely dissolved and you just feel at one with all that is. And it sounds, I say it and it's like, is this clear? I don't know that it's meant to be clear, but I think you would have experienced it while you're maybe in nature and you feel that there must be something more. Because when you're in nature, yes, it's the awe of the trees and the birds and that experience, but you sort of feel this like unity and oneness that transcends even where you are. So again, where do we see transcendent experiences? Of course, prayer, meditation, being just in complete silence and communion, where your sense of self fades away and you have this connection to all that is. I think women experience that or report experiencing that when they're in childbirth, where you really feel out of this world and this veil is lifted, as it's spoken about, where really you feel at one with everything. There is no world and not world. It's sort of like unity. It's all one. It's the sheer nature of the human body and what's possible, and this kind of bigger force that feels like it's holding everything in the balance. And so with this chapter, Jung is asserting that you cannot have the world without the otherworldly. You cannot have the seen without the unseen. You can't have mundane without extra mundane. Like you would need reason and rationality and irrationality. And so the world is often about separation, and where do I end and where do you begin, and what are the rules and what are all of the guidelines. And I think the other side of it is complete unity, complete love, transcending any of those limitations of the physical world. The physical world has to have limitations, right? Because if where I end and you begin there's no distinction, then we wouldn't have those physical difference boundaries, or we wouldn't have anything. There wouldn't be really nature. There wouldn't be a tree and me, and everything would just be like a puddle of the same stuff. We wouldn't have the distinctions that make the physical world so interesting to be in. But again, with all of those distinctions and all those categories and all of the differences, we need unity and love and oneness. So again, you need the polarities, and he's warning us that we need that point of reference outside of the external conditions of life. We need that relationship, so that awareness that there's an existence of that relationship, first of all, and that we can have the relationship beyond the physical world. And churches are creeds. Any kind of religious institution is a creed when it starts to become not about that. And so no institution in his mind is safe from the tendency to go beyond the level of analysis of the individual, and that we really need to watch for that. And it's not to say you can't have a community, but the community is only as valuable as the individuals within it and their moral and spiritual values and their regard for these irrational factors. So you need a community of people that agree, and that's what the church hopes to do, right? Is kind of, okay, you're going to have this relationship with God, and we all build our own relationship with the forces unseen, or the things beyond the physical world. We're all going to build this relationship, and we'll do it in communion. We'll do it together. But when it becomes about virtue signaling and posturing, and about worldly issues like social status and who goes to church and who didn't show up to church, and what did you wear to church, and which church do you go to, which denomination, we're getting out of unity, oneness, and into all the divisions of the worldly issues. And so he's saying, look, even the church, with these noble aims to connect the individual with God, or connect the individual with their relationship with this authority beyond the physical world, we run into problems, because we go out of the individual's responsibility, judgment, and morals, and into these kind of groups that create issues for us. So I think that's the main thing in this chapter. It's a relatively short chapter, but just so much to take in. And, I'd leave you with the question of, have you had this experience? Have you had this experience, a transcendent experience, where you really feel that evidence of something beyond the physical world? Again, you don't need any substance to do this, but there's a long history of humans utilizing different substances, and certainly now there's research of the substances. So we're trying to take this thing that's so intangible and make it into a research study with statistics and prove it, which I'm not saying there's no room for science in the worldly, and I don't think that's what he's saying either. What we're saying, and what he's saying, what I'm trying to convey, is that you need both sides of this coin to balance each other out. And so when the worldly, which is a church or state or any institution or any person who is speaking for an institution, is saying, hang on a minute, no, you don't need this, you need to listen to us, they're misguided. And the only source of truth is your connection with this bigger authority, whatever you want to call it, that relationship you have, the awareness that there are irrational factors when it comes to your individual fate. And in your psyche, there are things that are irrational, that are unseen, that cannot be and are not meant to be ordered or controlled, and you have a relationship to that. And in knowing that, you can, first of all, deal with any of the kind of weaknesses of the physical world. You can overcome those desires or wishes, those things that come to you in the world that make you go away from the true point, which is love, unity, oneness with the physical world and everything beyond it. And so, well, big chapter, big point, but not so many words, at least in the chapter. So hopefully I've done it justice. It's really saying, look, we need this part of our nature that is absolutely an innate part of ourselves. We can't just cut it off and give that power or that awareness to any human or any institution that is, again, just a collection of humans. We cannot do that. We need to remember that as individuals, our whole reason for existence, our whole foundation for freedom and autonomy in this world is knowing that there is something beyond it. And people try to put words to it, understand it. That's like, again, go for it. Try to explain what it is. But the most important part is being in commune with it, being in relationship, reciprocal relationship with it. And that's where all of these prayer, meditation practices, and that's why those are the most important parts of religions, the traditional, let's say, creeds, what we're talking about in this episode, right? That's the whole main point. That's the basis, is you getting closer to that connection. And so anything that draws you away from that is, in his theory, threatening the foundation for your freedom and autonomy. Because only when you have a good connection with things beyond this world, things unseen, can you operate fully in the realm of things that are seen, the worldly elements. So just as we need the feminine and masculine energies and traits, just as we need yin and yang, I mean, there are these counterparts. We need rational and irrational. So I hope you'll consider this, and really the question of when is it that you've had a transcendent experience or experienced something larger than life. I certainly have had a few instances in my life where I really felt like there has to be something more. And anybody that tries to attack that with rational arguments is, I think, missing my point. So rather than trying to disprove what I'm saying, ask yourself, have I experienced this? And what would I call it? And if you don't call it religion or God or whatever you call it, have you experienced it? Because his whole point is you have to experience this to understand it and then to value it. You have to have the awareness that it exists. That's, I mean, I say it like it's easy, but that's the point, is that you're aware that it exists and that it's important, and that it's just as important as the things that you see and the things of this world. And if you can, whatever you want to call it is up to you. I think the words, which again, make it discreet, make it into these boxes, are what has bothered people and driven people away. And the creed component of religion, the creed part, which is all the social components and things that aren't actually about that personal relationship you have with this force. Okay. Anything that's gone away from that, which is a lot of churches, a lot of things done in the name of religion, really throw people off. But this isn't about the church. And it's certainly not about the state. This is about you as this person listening to this episode, being in commune with that, being aware of the existence of something bigger, this kind of pulse of the universe, if you want to say, right? Being aware that there's something more, and then tapping into it. And so that when you come back to earth, so to speak, you know it's there, you know it's always there. There's this unity and oneness and force. And there are things of this world. So we don't try to remove the things of this world. We have to have the reverence for the other side of the equation. So hope to see you next time. We'll be talking about the position of the West on the question of religion. So this will be an important foundation. If you haven't listened to episode 1 yet, I would encourage you to. It definitely sets the stage for what we talked about today. And yeah, if you've liked this, please do share it with somebody or write a review. Any way that you can interact with the podcast really helps. So liking it, following it, commenting, writing a review, sharing it with someone. All of those things make a big difference. Donating to the show so I can keep running it and spending time on interesting things like this. All of it really helps. So appreciate you taking the time to listen and ponder these big kind of existential questions that make the foundation for our freedom and autonomy as individuals. And I hope to see you next time on the position of the West on this question of religion. Take good care until then.